Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, I apologize for interrupting your testimony, but I have a simple question. My constituents back in Louisiana keep asking me, how much does this Green New Deal you're proposing actually cost? Senator John Kennedy's slow Southern drawl, cutting through Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's carefully rehearsed speech, like a quiet cough in a cathedral. And, for the first time since the hearing began, the room felt different, less like a stage and more like a courtroom, where someone had just asked the one question nobody wanted to answer. AOC had been mid-flow, building toward another emotional crescendo about climate justice, generational responsibility, and moral urgency, the kind of rhetoric that played beautifully on cable news and even better in short social media clips. But now she paused, blinked, and looked at Kennedy with a mix of irritation and disbelief, as if he'd missed the point of the entire performance. "Senator, this isn't really about cost," she replied, voice still calm but edged with that familiar tone of moral impatience. "This is about whether we're willing to save the planet for future generations, and whether we care more about human lives than spreadsheets." "I understand morality just fine," Kennedy said gently, not raising his voice, not smiling, not frowning either, just steady. "I go to church, I read my Bible, I try to be a decent person, but I'm also on the Senate Budget Committee, which means I have to think about money. So I'll ask again, how much does it cost?" The cameras caught AOC shifting slightly in her seat. A tiny movement most people wouldn't notice, but in politics, those micro moments matter, because they reveal when someone is thinking, recalculating, or quietly realizing that the script they memorized doesn't cover the next line. "Estimates vary depending on implementation," she said after a brief pause, choosing the safest possible answer, the kind that sounds reasonable without committing to anything. "I'm not asking about other people's estimates," Kennedy replied, still polite, still calm. "I'm asking you. You wrote it. You introduced it. You're here promoting it. Surely you have some idea." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was awkward. The kind that feels longer than it is, because everyone in the room knows something uncomfortable is happening, but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it. "That's not how legislation works, Senator," she said, trying to pivot. "We outline goals, we create a framework, and then experts work out the details." "So you're asking the United States government to spend taxpayer money, potentially the largest amount in history, but you don't know how much," Kennedy said, his tone still soft, almost apologetic. "Is that what you're telling this committee?" At that moment, AOC wasn't dealing with a hostile attack. She was dealing with something far more dangerous in Washington. A reasonable question, because no matter where you fall politically, how much does it cost, is not exactly a radical concept in public policy. She tried again. "The cost of inaction is far greater than—" "Ma'am, with respect, that's not an answer," Kennedy interrupted. Not sharply, not rudely, just enough to keep the conversation on his terms. He pulled out a document, a thick stack of papers that looked boring and deadly at the same time. The American Action Forum estimates the Green New Deal would cost about $93 trillion over 10 years. That's over $9 trillion per year. Our entire federal budget right now is about $6 trillion. Does that number sound about right to you? AOC's jaw tightened, not because she hadn't heard the number before, but because saying yes sounded insane and saying no required an alternative she didn't have. "Those are conservative estimates designed to make the plan sound unrealistic," she said. "So you do have a number," Kennedy replied. "What is it?" "I'm not going to engage with bad faith Republican talking points." Kennedy looked almost wounded, which in hindsight was probably part of the strategy, ma'am. "I promise you I'm not asking in bad faith. I represent people who work hard, pay taxes. Some of them work on oil rigs. Some farm. Some run small businesses. and they want to know how much of their money you want to spend. That seems like a fair question. It was the kind of line that didn't sound clever, didn't sound aggressive, but landed hard because it framed the entire exchange as a basic accountability issue rather than a partisan fight. The truth, which everyone in that room understood even if nobody said it out loud, was that AOC couldn't give a real number because any serious analysis of the Green New Deal landed somewhere between wildly expensive and structurally impossible. And admitting that would have punctured the entire myth of bold, simple solutions. Kennedy waited, letting the silence do the work. "Let me help you out," he finally said, still polite. $93 trillion. That's more than 4 times our GDP. That's more money than exists in America. So my question is simple. How do we pay for it? AOC glanced briefly toward the other Democratic senators, but they suddenly found their notes extremely interesting because no one wanted to jump into a conversation that revolved around arithmetic instead of values. She tried again. The cost of inaction. "Ma'am," he said again gently, not raising his voice, "that's still not an answer." From there, the hearing stopped being a performance and turned into something closer to a slow-motion collision between political messaging and financial reality. With Kennedy walking through cost categories one by one, building retrofits, energy infrastructure, job guarantees, healthcare expansion, student debt, each time asking the same simple question in slightly different ways, and each time receiving an answer that sounded inspiring but not especially concrete. At no point did Kennedy accuse her of lying. At no point did he suggest corruption or bad motives. He just kept circling the same theme. Numbers matter, trade-offs exist, and moral urgency doesn't magically replace economic constraints. When she pivoted to modern monetary theory, he didn't laugh, didn't mock, just pointed out that even the Federal Reserve and most mainstream economists were skeptical and asked calmly whether she genuinely believed printing trillions of dollars wouldn't cause inflation. When she spoke about job creation, he brought up the Amazon headquarters deal in New York, not as a scandal but as a basic question. How do you reconcile opposing a project that would have created tens of thousands of high-paying jobs with your claim to champion workers? When she spoke about living wages, he asked about small businesses and unintended consequences, not as a gotcha, but as an illustration of how every policy creates winners and losers. And the more he asked, the clearer it became that the real tension in the room wasn't between Republicans and Democrats. It was between political storytelling and policy engineering. At one point, after nearly an hour of this, AOC raised her voice slightly, accusing Kennedy of playing games with numbers while the planet was burning, a line that might have gone viral in another context. But in that room it felt out of place, because he hadn't been playing with numbers, he'd been stuck on them. "I care about the environment too," Kennedy replied, voice steady but firmer now. "I want clean air for my grandchildren. But I also care about not bankrupting the country. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive." When he mentioned nuclear power as a potential solution and asked why it wasn't central to her plan, she hesitated, not because she hated nuclear, but because her political base did, and suddenly the conversation wasn't about science anymore, it was about coalition management. The moment that really shifted the mood, though, came near the end, when he asked a question that wasn't about money or jobs or energy, but about intent. "Do you actually believe the Green New Deal as written is feasible, or is it mainly a messaging document?" he asked, not aggressively, but with the tone of someone genuinely curious. That question hung in the air longer than any other, because it cut through all the layers of rhetoric and went straight to the heart of modern political communication. Are you proposing something you think can happen, or something you think should inspire people? AOC didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. She said, "I believe we have to try." And in politics, "we have to try" is often code for, "we don't actually know how this works, but it feels right." Kennedy didn't argue after that. He didn't need to. He just pointed out that spending trillions of dollars on "we have to try" wasn't exactly a funding model, and that wanting a better world didn't exempt anyone from the responsibility of explaining how to get there. By the time the hearing ended, nothing explosive had happened. Nobody had shouted, nobody had stormed out, but the narrative had shifted in a subtle and dangerous way for AOC. Because the viral moment wasn't her fiery rhetoric, it was Kennedy asking again and again, "How much does it cost?" Not because the question was devastating on its own, but because it revealed a deeper issue in modern politics: the growing gap between symbolic ambition and operational detail, between selling a vision and managing a system. The headlines the next day reflected that tension, not in dramatic terms, but in cautious language. Ocasio-Cortez pressed on economic details. Green New Deal faces fiscal questions. Supporters call for clearer funding plans. Even friendly commentators admitted something felt off. Not because her goals were wrong, but because she couldn't articulate the mechanics without sliding back into moral arguments. And maybe that's the real lesson of that hearing, not that one side won or the other lost, but that, in a political culture increasingly built around viral moments and emotional resonance, the most dangerous weapon isn't outrage, it's arithmetic. Kennedy didn't expose hypocrisy. He didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He didn't even challenge her sincerity. He just kept asking for the missing layer between aspiration and execution. How much does it cost? Where does the money come from? What happens if the assumptions are wrong? Those questions aren't ideological, they're structural, and they haunt every ambitious policy proposal, no matter who introduces it. Years from now, that exchange will probably be remembered less as a clash of personalities and more as a case study in political communication. The moment when a movement built on moral urgency ran into the slow, stubborn gravity of financial reality, and neither side quite knew how to reconcile the two. Not because anyone was dishonest, not because anyone was evil, but because wanting change is easier than designing it, and sounding bold is easier than being precise. And in American politics, the line between the two has never been thinner. After the cameras went dark and the senators filed out, the hearing didn't really end. It just moved locations, because in Washington, the real proceedings happen in the hallways, the green rooms, the text chains, and the little clusters of staffers pretending not to listen while they absolutely listen. AOC's team tried to regroup fast because they understood what had happened, even if they didn't want to say it out loud. The exchange wasn't just awkward, it was mimetic, and mimetic is the modern word for "this is going to follow you." Kennedy's staff, meanwhile, didn't celebrate like cartoon villains twirling mustaches. They just did that quiet, professional thing staffers do when a plan works. The same look you see on a football sideline when a trick play actually hits. Nobody needed to claim anyone was a fraud or a saint to see the core problem. The story that sells is always cleaner than the system that governs. And that's where the hearing left AOC, stuck between a message built for momentum and a committee built for math. In the first hour after, reporters didn't chase her with wild accusations. They asked the simplest follow-ups, the kind you can't dodge without looking like you're dodging. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, do you have an internal estimate of total cost, even a range, even a placeholder figure you're working from? Representative Ocasio-Cortez, would you support a dedicated revenue stream, a carbon tax, a VAT-style approach, something concrete voters can understand? Representative Ocasio-Cortez, why not a more targeted package, Why not pair nuclear with renewables if the goal is emissions reduction rather than ideological purity? None of those questions require an enemy. They just require an answer. And that's exactly why they're hard. Her staff tried to steer her away from the scrum, which is normal, but the optics were bad because walking away in politics always looks like running away, even when it's just trying not to miss your next vote. Inside her office, the first instinct was to treat Kennedy's line of questioning as a motive problem. He's hostile. He's trying to undermine climate action. He's performing for conservatives, which is a comforting story because it makes the situation moral instead of mechanical. But then someone, maybe a policy aide, maybe a nervous comms person who still remembered how budgeting actually works, asked the inconvenient question, what if the problem isn't his intent? What if the problem is that we didn't come armed with a real number? That question changes the entire posture, because now the attack isn't a smear you can denounce, it's a gap you have to fill. And filling it means committing to a number that will make someone angry no matter what it is. This is where the Green New Deal, as a political object, starts to show its weird dual nature, because it's both a banner and a blueprint, depending on who's talking about it. To supporters, it's a moral North Star, a set of priorities, a sign that somebody finally takes climate seriously and isn't afraid to dream big. To skeptics, it's a list of promises stapled together with vibes, a grand aspiration that refuses to touch the ground long enough to be measured. To politicians who quietly like parts of it but fear the sticker shock, it's a public posture and a private headache, because they want the enthusiasm without the invoice. So when Kennedy demanded a number, he wasn't just interrogating AOC, he was forcing everyone else to decide what the document actually was. That's why the other Democrats went silent at the table, because if you jump in to help, you inherit the question. And the second you inherit the question, you're attached to the answer. If you defend AOC by saying it's just a framework, you're basically admitting it's not ready for prime time, which is a problem if you've been treating it like the centerpiece of a national agenda. If you defend her by throwing out a number, you own that number. And in American politics, owning the number is how you get turned into a 30-second ad with ominous music. If you defend her by attacking Kennedy's motives, you're implicitly conceding the substance, because you're switching from "here's the math" to "don't listen to him," which rarely persuades anyone who isn't already on your side. So the smart political move in that moment was to stare at your notes and pray the camera doesn't zoom in on your face. And to be fair, AOC wasn't the first politician to get caught between a moral pitch and a technical interrogation. That's basically a Washington rite of passage. Republicans do it on tax cuts all the time, promising growth will magically cover the cost, until someone asks for a score, and the room suddenly needs a bathroom break. Democrats do it on social programs, promising savings and efficiencies will bridge gaps, until someone asks which savings and which efficiencies and how quickly they arrive. The difference here was the scale, because 93 trillion is a number so big most people don't feel it. They just hear astronomical and make a face like they smelled something strange. And Kennedy's whole trick was to make the number feel tactile by comparing it to things people recognize: budgets, GDP, debt ratios, basic household logic. What made it brutal wasn't that he acted like a bully, it's that he played it like a customer asking the price of an item on a shelf. Imagine walking into a store, picking up the biggest thing in the building, turning to the salesperson and asking, "How much is this?" And the salesperson says, "It's not about money, it's about values." At a certain point, you're not even offended. You're just confused, because you didn't ask about their values, you asked about the price tag. That's how the exchange read to a lot of ordinary viewers, not as a grand ideological battle, but as a simple mismatch between rhetoric and accountability. And when politics feels like customer service, the side that answers the question wins, even if the answer is unpopular. In the days that followed, the story metastasized the way modern stories do, not through official statements, but through clipped moments, captions, reaction videos, and endless "let me break this down" commentary. You didn't need to love Kennedy to recognize the force of his framing, because the frame wasn't "AOC is bad." The frame was "AOC can't quantify her proposal." You didn't need to hate the Green New Deal to ask, okay, if we're serious, what are the major cost drivers? What's phased? What's optional? What's mandatory? What's the funding mix? You didn't even need to be political to sense the vulnerability, because most people have had a version of this conversation in their own lives. Big plan, big dream, and then someone asks, can we afford it? And if you've never had that conversation, you've probably caused someone else to have it. This is also where the internal tension inside the climate coalition starts to show, because not everyone wants the same fight. Some activists want maximal demands because maximal demands move the Overton window, and if you start reasonable, you end up with crumbs. Some policy wonks want surgical legislation that can pass because they've seen sweeping packages die under their own weight and take the whole agenda down with them. Some elected Democrats want the inspiration, but not the exposure, meaning they love the rally, but dread the audit. And some Republicans, sensing an opening, aren't trying to solve anything. They're trying to brand the whole enterprise as unserious by turning "how much" into a permanent punchline. AOC's team did what political teams always do in that moment. They tried to change the subject without making it look like they were changing the subject. They emphasized moral urgency again. They talked about wildfires and storms and asthma rates and frontline communities, all real issues that deserve attention. They highlighted the jobs message, the idea that investment could create employment and reshape industries, which is also true in broad strokes. They pointed to the fact that large policy frameworks often precede detailed legislative language, which is correct as a procedural matter. But none of that fully answered the question Kennedy had planted in the center of the room like a traffic cone. What's the number? And how do you pay it? If you want to understand why this matters, you have to understand how persuasion works on undecided viewers, because they're rarely moved by maximal ideology. They're moved by competence cues, by the sense that someone understands consequences and has thought beyond the applause line. AOC has always been good at the moral argument. She's a natural communicator. She can make an issue feel personal and immediate in a way many politicians can't. But competence is a different theater. It's the theater of trade-offs, sequences, budgets, and the grimy details that don't fit on a poster. And Kennedy basically forced her to step into that theater without rehearsal. Now, could AOC have answered differently? And would it have saved her? That's the real counterfactual people argued about for weeks. She could have said, look, the resolution doesn't contain a final price tag, but here are the ranges we're studying. Here are the pillars. Here's what's paid back through savings. Here's what requires new revenue. And here's the timeline. She could have admitted uncertainty without sounding clueless. Because uncertainty is normal in massive programs, the key is showing you've mapped the uncertainty instead of ignoring it. She could have pointed out that the $93 trillion estimate makes aggressive assumptions and then offered a competing framework with citations and categories rather than vibes. She could have said, if you want the honest answer, this is a multi-decade transition, not a 10-year spending spree, and the cost depends on choices we haven't made yet, and here are the choices. But doing that requires a different kind of preparation, the kind built for committee rooms, not applause. And here's the uncomfortable part nobody wants to say plainly. In American politics, admitting complexity is often punished, even when it's the honest answer. A neat slogan beats a complicated explanation. A dramatic moral claim beats a conditional budget estimate. And a crisp enemy beats a nuanced constraint. So AOC's whole political brand, like many modern brands, rewards her for being the person who says the thing loudly, not necessarily the person who works the spreadsheet quietly. Kennedy exploited that mismatch, and again, you don't have to admire him to see the mechanics. He didn't beat her by out-yelling her. He beat her by forcing her to play a game she didn't come to play. That's why the exchange stuck, because it wasn't really about climate policy anymore. It was about governance itself. Can a movement built on moral clarity survive contact with administrative reality? Or does it melt the moment someone asks for implementation details? Can a politician built for rhetorical combat pivot into managerial credibility without losing the energy that made them famous? Can the public tolerate honest trade-offs? Or do we demand perfect outcomes with invisible costs, like children asking for a pony and getting mad when you mention hay? And maybe the sharpest question of all, why do we keep rewarding politicians for being good at the show and then act surprised when they struggle with the job? By the end of that week, the conversation around the hearing had quietly drifted away from AOC herself and towards something broader and more uncomfortable. The growing sense that American politics was becoming a competition between storytellers rather than problem solvers. People weren't really arguing about climate anymore. They were arguing about credibility, about who sounded like they understood the machine they were trying to operate. And that's a dangerous shift, because once a debate becomes about competence instead of values, emotion stops being enough to carry you. You can believe in the right things and still lose the room if you can't explain how those things actually happen. In a media ecosystem built on short clips and fast outrage, Kennedy had accidentally staged a long-form moment, and long-form moments expose gaps that viral moments usually hide. What made the situation especially tricky for AOC was that she wasn't wrong about the stakes. Climate change is real, environmental damage is costly, and delay has consequences. But politics doesn't reward being right in principle. It rewards being convincing in practice. Viewers who were open to her message didn't suddenly become climate skeptics after the hearing. They just became climate skeptics about her plan. That's a subtle but devastating distinction because it shifts doubt from the problem to the solution, which is much harder to fix. You can't just repeat the same pitch louder once people start questioning the mechanics. Inside Democratic circles, there was a quiet recognition that Kennedy had touched a nerve most of them preferred to avoid. Many lawmakers privately supported aggressive climate action, but also feared being tied to a single, massive, undefined spending package. They liked the ambition but hated the exposure, because "we'll figure it out later" works on Twitter, but not in a budget hearing. Some started floating alternative language, smaller packages, narrower targets, carbon pricing, infrastructure bills that sounded less like revolutions and more like renovations. Not because they'd abandoned the cause, but because they'd seen how easily it could be reframed as fantasy if the numbers stayed fuzzy. For AOC, the strategic dilemma became obvious almost immediately. If she doubled down on moral rhetoric, she risked looking evasive. If she pivoted to technical detail, she risked alienating the audience that loved her precisely because she wasn't a technocrat. If she admitted the Green New Deal was more vision than blueprint, she undercut years of branding built around it, being bold and concrete. Every path forward involved losing something, either emotional resonance or policy credibility, and there was no clean way to keep both. And this is where Kennedy's style mattered more than his ideology. He didn't argue like a culture warrior. He argued like a guy auditing a contractor. He wasn't asking whether the dream was beautiful. He was asking whether the foundation could hold the building. That kind of questioning doesn't generate instant applause, but it generates long-term doubt, which is far more corrosive. Once people start asking, "Does this add up?" they don't stop easily, because math, unlike ideology, doesn't get offended. What also made the moment linger was how undramatic it was. There was no viral shouting match, no insults, no personal scandals, no tabloid hooks. Just a slow accumulation of unanswered questions. And unanswered questions are poison in politics because they invite viewers to fill the gaps themselves. When politicians don't provide numbers, the audience invents them. And invented numbers are almost always worse than real ones. Over time, the hearing became less of a clip and more of a reference point. Commentators didn't say, "AOC is wrong." They said, "Remember that hearing when she couldn't give a cost." Candidates didn't say, "I oppose climate action." They said, "I support climate action, but not like that." Even supporters started using softer language. The Green New Deal is a starting point. It's an aspirational framework. It's about shifting the conversation, which, translated into political reality, meant, "Please don't ask me to defend the budget line by line." The irony is that Kennedy didn't actually kill anything directly. He didn't pass a bill. He didn't block legislation. He didn't rewrite policy. All he did was introduce a new filter through which people evaluated it. Before, the Green New Deal was judged by how it made people feel. After, it was judged by whether it could survive a spreadsheet. And once that shift happens, no amount of passion can reverse it. This is the part most political narratives avoid because it's less exciting than heroes and villains. Policy rarely dies because someone is evil. It dies because it's incomplete, because it promises more than it can specify, because it assumes goodwill can substitute for logistics, and because someone eventually asks the boring question that turns inspiration into inventory. In another universe, that hearing could have gone differently. AOC could have treated Kennedy's question as an opportunity rather than a threat. She could have said, "Here's what we know, here's what we don't, here's the range, here's how we phase it, here's what's funded now and what depends on future growth." That answer wouldn't have gone viral, but it would have built institutional trust. Instead, the moment went viral for the opposite reason. It showed what happens when performance outruns preparation. And maybe that's the real tension underneath the whole episode. Modern politics rewards people for being symbols, not systems. It wants faces, not formulas. It wants narratives, not balance sheets. But governing is the exact opposite. It's slow, technical, frustrating, and relentlessly numerical. You can't govern in metaphors. You govern in line items. Kennedy didn't win because he was more moral. He didn't win because he was more charismatic. He won because he forced the conversation into a domain where charisma doesn't carry you, where only coherence does. And once you're there, every missing answer feels louder than any speech. Not because people are cruel, but because systems don't care about intentions. So the hearing ended up standing as something larger than two politicians talking past each other. It became a quiet reminder that in American politics, the hardest part isn't getting people to agree on what should happen. It's getting anyone to explain how it actually happens. And until someone can bridge that gap without hiding behind slogans or drowning in spreadsheets, the same story will keep repeating. Big promise, big applause, small details, and eventually, the one question nobody rehearsed for: how much does it really cost?